Hey, what's going on guys, this is AndrewChicken and welcome back to another video. Finding the right settings is an important part of any game, and Paladins is no exception. Paladins has a lot of complicated and possibly confusing settings that can dramatically alter your gameplay experience, and it's important to understand how they work. You also might be wondering why your game looks different than what you see in YouTube videos and streams, or why your VGS inputs are different to other people's. That's why in this video I'll be giving an in-depth explanation of the settings in Paladins, and recommending which settings you should change to get the best experience possible. Before we begin, I'd really appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel so you can stay up to date whenever I drop a new guide. But with that being said, let's go ahead and get straight into the video. Up first are the video settings, which only have a few key options we need to talk about. Most of the settings here, like the graphical detail settings, anti-aliasing, and resolution scale, depend entirely on how strong your PC is, and you should tailor these settings to your needs. One setting that isn't so straightforward is the one at the very top, which can enable or disable D3D11. This setting determines which back-end renderer Paladins uses, and it can cause your game to run faster. By default, Paladins runs using DirectX 9, which is an older engine that is generally less efficient and may cause your game to run more slowly. Turning on DirectX 11, or D3D11, may improve your performance, but it can also cause some issues when rendering semi-invisible champions and effects. Atlas's Rewind, Grok's Ghostwalk, a friendly invisible sky on your team, and the distance indicator and payload are all examples of abilities that have a chance to render as invisible instead of ethereal. This can make the game harder to play in some circumstances, like when healing invisible players on your team. This doesn't happen on all devices, but it is a known phenomenon, and it even affected me on my old computer. Just test it out for yourself, and if everything is rendering properly, then DirectX 11 is the better choice. If things aren't rendering properly, then it's up to you to choose whether you want better performance or proper rendering. Another way to squeeze out some extra performance applies not just to Paladins, but to every game you play. By running Paladins in full screen, the game will run a lot smoother than if you run it in borderless windowed or windowed. The major downside to this is that switching to other applications is not easy, requiring you to Alt-tab in and out of the game. On lower-end machines, this can be risky and cause your game to misbehave or potentially crash, so be careful when switching to other apps. The next option to talk about is your FOV. This setting determines the amount of things you can see on your screen at once by widening or narrowing your vision. Playing the game at the highest FOV can greatly boost your overall awareness in the match because you can take much more advantage of your peripheral vision. For champions who are especially reliant on spatial awareness like Eevee, having a high FOV is extremely important. If you're colorblind, Paladins has 3 colorblind filters which it can apply to your game to help improve your clarity. You can also control the strength of the effect to suit your needs. Sadly, however, there are no options to completely customize the UI like in Overwatch, but these filters can still be helpful and are good to know about if you're colorblind. Now before we move on, I want to show you one last setting that isn't actually available in the settings menu. In a match, if you press the F9 key on your keyboard, you'll pull up this handy display on the right of your screen which shows your FPS and, if you're not in the shooting range, your ping. This can be useful to show if your game is underperforming and if your connection to the server is good or bad. Bear in mind that you want to have high FPS but low ping. Anyways, let's move on to the audio settings. Like in the video section, these settings are mostly straightforward. If you turn music volume off but are still confused why you can hear the music from skins like Rave Mave, that's because there's a separate toggle to disable character music. This toggle is completely independent from the music volume slider, and you sadly can't control the volume of the music from these skins at all. Voice chat is also important to talk about, since it can be a useful tool especially in your ranked matches. For some reason, voice chat does not work in Siege, but it does work in ranked, payload, and bot matches. It also works in every game mode if you are in a party, but only for the people in your party. It's a good idea to use push to talk instead of just having your mic on all the time, so that way you can control what your teammates hear. After all, you don't want them to hear something embarrassing. Aside from that, there's nothing else to talk about in the audio section. So let's move on to the longest section and talk about gameplay settings. There's a lot of really important stuff here that you should pay attention to and adjust accordingly. Show game tips can toggle the small hint prompts you get when something happens like getting killed by a certain champion, and it can be helpful when you're new to the game. After a while though, it's best to turn them off. Also, if you want even better tips than what the game can provide you, I highly recommend checking out my Paladins Beginner's Guide playlist on YouTube. I'll have a link to that in the description below. Damage numbers are very important to leave on, since they provide useful information during the match. Damage numbers can quickly inform you whether an enemy has damage reduction in the middle of a fight, and they're also generally a helpful indicator for letting you know if you've done damage or not. Combat log appears to have no noticeable difference on the game whatsoever. It's best to leave it on just in case, but don't worry about it too much. VGS input type is a very important setting, especially if you're a returning player who hasn't played in a long time. Paladins' VGS system was different many years ago, and was changed in an attempt to make it more accommodating for new players. If you want to go back to that old system, then you can switch your input type to Legacy Deprecated to gain access to all the old commands again. This old system actually lets you have more control over what your character says because some voice lines have separate commands, such as curses, and that's too bad. Even though some important commands are faster to type in the new system, such as group up and help, some players might still find the old system more intuitive because of its command naming. For example, to exclaim woohoo, the new default system has you type VCEE, while the old system has you type VEW. The radial and text options merely change how the default VGS is displayed and interacted with on the screen. The radial option allows you to click each option instead of typing in a command, which I wouldn't recommend because it will interrupt your gameplay and distract from your aiming. The text option consolidates the default wheel into a small text box on the left of the screen. It's harder to read at a glance, but it's much less distracting than the radial. Scoreboard Advanced is another setting that appears to do absolutely nothing. In my testing, the only notable difference was that for some reason, when pressing R to switch tabs like I normally do, it instead pulled up my Steam profile. It only ever pulled up mine though, never anyone else in the lobby. This setting is certainly strange, and I'd advise just leaving it off. Always show player health is important for obvious reasons, so make sure that's on. The next two settings explain why your game probably looks different to mine and most other streamers' games. Most streamers play with the centered skill bar enabled, because it allows viewers to see their items and loadout name on the right side of the screen. Veteran players often play with this on too, since it used to be the default back in the day. HUD skills order also modifies your HUD in a much less drastic way, and both of these settings can be tailored to your personal preference. The next setting is one of the most important settings to turn on, if it isn't already. Show Team UI is a very big deal, because it transforms your HUD from this to this. The Team UI allows you to see the ultimate charge, health pool, and respawn timer of every member on your team at all times, giving you crucial information at a glance that can help you keep teammates alive and win the game. I absolutely implore you to turn this on, because it's extremely important. Show Allied Death Markers is a setting that can be helpful to let you know who on your team is dead, how many players are dead, and where they all died at a glance. This setting basically leaves a token in the air above where an ally died, and is generally pretty helpful. If you find it distracting, turning it off isn't a bad thing, as long as you still have the Team UI turned on. The heal feed is another very important setting to turn on. This shows you where sources of healing are coming from and how large those sources are. You can choose to show these numbers in the middle or bottom of your screen, but I prefer the middle because it's easier to see. Wherever you decide to put these numbers, just make sure they're on because they're very important. If you're a new player, this next setting is extremely important. Auto purchase items is a setting that you need to turn off. The game will automatically buy items for you by default, and this is really bad because it takes away your ability to choose how you upgrade your character and counter the enemies. The auto-buy system usually purchases items that aren't super helpful, and it almost never purchases situational items like Illuminate or Wrecker properly. I know the item system can be hard to get into as a new player, and that's why I have a separate itemization guide which goes in detail on how the item shop works. Watch that if you're new to the item shop, and please turn auto-buy off. Finally, we get to some settings that are still important, but are ultimately highly customizable and are entirely up to your personal preference. I won't go into detail here about choosing the right reticle for you, and it's something you should play around with until you're happy. The same goes for your controller icon style and toggle zoom. They're all settings that are situational and specific to you. Next, we have another super important setting, Show Cauterize on Team Health Bar. This is imperative to turn on, especially for healers. Knowing who is and isn't under the effect of Cauterize is a big deal for prioritizing who to heal and when, especially in the late game. Timing your healing to hit people when they're out of Cauterize is an important skill to learn, and it's basically impossible without this setting turned on. Make sure this is enabled at all times. Card cooldowns is the last extremely important setting, and you should turn it on. This setting shows the cooldown of cards that have internal cooldowns on the bottom right of your screen, such as when using Masterful with Drogos. It can be a bit buggy at times, but that doesn't mean you should turn it off because it's still very helpful. Lastly, we have Do Not Disturb. Toggling this on will prevent other players from direct messaging you or inviting you to parties, which is very useful if you're getting annoyed by a pesky player or you're a streamer. You can turn this setting on from the in-game chat by typing /DND. Finally, we get to move on to the control settings. There's not much to talk about here, but there are still two important settings to discuss. If you're a keyboard and mouse player, mouse smoothing is a setting that you need to turn off. Mouse smoothing slows the acceleration of your mouse, making it much harder to flickshot and generally just turn around. It's a really bad idea to have this on. The next option I want to talk about is crossplay. This setting allows you to determine whether you want to play with players from all input types or just your own. One important thing to keep in mind is that this only affects casual matches and not ranked. As of the Midnight Masquerade update, crossplay is forced on in ranked, regardless of your crossplay setting here. Otherwise, the rest of these settings regard your sensitivity, and you should tailor these to suit your individual needs. One interesting side note is that the scope sensitivity affects Yaggoroth whenever she starts shooting. Yeah, it's pretty weird, I know. But with those last few settings out of the way, we are basically done. The rest of the settings from this point pertain to your key bindings, which you can customize to fit your needs and don't need any explanation. The spectator settings are also not important at all, and can be completely ignored. Hopefully you found this video to be helpful, and if you did, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more guides coming from me in the future. If you want to learn more about other Paladins mechanics, I recommend checking out my Paladins Beginner's Guide playlist on YouTube, or just ask me questions directly on my Discord server or when I'm live on Twitch. You can also support me by making your next crystal purchase over at my Nexus, which can be found in the description below. But with all that being said, thank you guys for watching, I will see you all next time, peace out.